Hello everyone, welcome to this first lecture in Unit 2 on our series on political science. And Unit 2 is going to be a little bit different than Unit 1 because we're going to be discussing theories of international relations this time. And international relations are both highly connected to our theories in Unit 1, but they're also fundamentally different. Theories of international relations really focus less on human behavior and how things should be, and instead they try to figure out how the system actually works. And you often see really profound disagreement between the theories in looking at sort of the same series of events and drawing drastically different conclusions. So, as we said, just like with Section 1, there's some theories about how international relations works. But behind each theories, you have to consider that there's a set of assumptions, a bunch of hypotheses that you have to take as true, as about politics, about people, and about the world itself, because otherwise you cannot proceed. There are certain things that you have to take as a given. Unlike theories of national politics, however, when we talk about international relations, we talk a lot about systems. So there are multiple actors in those systems, and understanding how they interact with each other is a big part of international relations theory. But of course, deciding who even gets to be an actor is a part of those theories. And as I said before, international relations really doesn't study what governments should do. That's Unit 1. International relations studies instead how governments actually behave when it comes to international affairs and why they behave the way they do, because the why is equally as important. And so when we construct a theory, understand that our assumptions are the things that we take for granted before we begin to make our theories. Actors we define as entities with agency, with the ability to make decisions within the international system, and the theory is really their interaction. The interaction between the assumptions and the actors to find out how these rational actors behave. And so our first theory, classical realism, starts off by asking a question. Are people good or are they bad? Because if people are good, then they behave in a certain way in international relations. But if they are bad and cannot be trusted, well, then behavior changes in international relations. The way you approach different countries is different in international relations. And so when we talk about classical realism, when we talk about the actors that matter in classical realism, the only actors that matter are states. And these states are assumed to be rational. They make decisions based on cost-benefit analysis, based on what is good for them in the moment and why. They are inherently self-interested, and because they are self-interested, they cannot rely on anyone else to come help them, because countries will only help you if it is in their own personal self-interest. And so you're essentially relying on the idea that it's a self-help system. Also, there is no overarching power in the world system. So for classical realists, the world is inherently anarchic. The world has no overarching power structure, and because of that, the world can be chaotic. It can be uncertain. And because of that, exactly because of that, we live in a self-help system. Countries that cannot help themselves get crushed. And the last premise, perhaps the most important premise in classical realism, is that power is zero-sum. By zero-sum, we mean that there is a finite amount of it in the world. In order for one country to become stronger, another country must become weaker. Power is relative. So let me give you an example here. Let's say that in order to become more powerful, country A invests heavily in nuclear weapons and builds a nuclear weapon from the ground up. That's all well and good. But if every other actor in the system has done the same thing and built 5 nuclear weapons, well, suddenly Even though country A has become stronger, it's more importantly become weaker because its power is only important in relation to other countries. So even though country A is more powerful, they've built a new nuke, they're also weaker because everyone else around them has built 5. This is exactly what we mean when we talk about power being zero-sum, power being relative. And because of that, because of this zero-sum game, because of this self-help system, states must maintain and increase their power in order to survive. If you're not always maximizing the amount of power that you are acquiring, you cannot say for certain that other countries in the system are doing the same. So if you're not always maximizing your power, you are by definition getting weaker because everyone else in the system is getting more powerful, because power is zero-sum. Now, you may ask yourself, which of these theories of domestic politics does realism pull on the most? And I think the answer is obvious, that it pulls directly from Thomas Hobbes. In fact, this idea of an anarchic world system comes directly from Hobbes' state of nature. In fact, when Hobbes talks about the idea that where there is no power keeping men in awe, it's a state called war, and such a war is of every man against every man, for a realist, that's sort of an accurate description of the world system, because inherently the world system has no Leviathan. The world system has no overarching power structure that countries can turn to for protection. There's no global 911. If a country decides to invade you for whatever reason, you cannot turn to the Avengers, for example, to come in and save you. That's not an option. And so you have to rely on yourself. And because it's a self-help system, relying on yourself means acquiring as much power as possible. Now, a discussion that realists often turn to is the Melian dialogue coming out of Thucydides. Now, Thucydides is one of those Greek philosophers that we did not look at the beginning of the course. He writes a history of the Peloponnesian War. And in his history of the Peloponnesian War, which is, if you remember back to high school, a war between Athens and Sparta, there's a scene in the history of the Peloponnesian War that realists often point to as sort of the first inkling of realism in international relations. Now, the story goes as follows. The island of Milos was a small island off the coast of Greece. On paper, it was allied with Sparta, but in practice, it had maintained its neutrality through the war. It had not participated in any major battle. The Melians were not particularly powerful, but they were very good at building ships. And so one day, on the horizon, you see an Athenian fleet coming for the island of Milos. They land on the beach, and the general of the Athenian soldiers strolls up to the city and says, "Congratulations, you will be building ships for the Athenians now." And the Melians say, "Well, if it's all right with you, we would rather not, because the minute we agree to build ships for you and you leave, the Spartans are going to come here and they're going to kill us all for being traitors." Now, of course, the Athenian general gets upset about this, and he says, "I'm going to give you 24 hours. When I come back here tomorrow, I expect you to agree to my terms, or I'm going to slaughter you all and destroy you so that you cannot build ships for our enemies." So 24 hours come and go, and the next day, the Melians talk to the Athenian general, and they turn down the offer. They say, "No thanks, we would rather go neutral on this." Therefore, the Athenians destroy the city of Milos, kill every man in the city, sell all the women and children into slavery, and sail away, leaving Milos completely destroyed. What's the moral of the story? Well, For Thucydides, the moral of the story is that the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. For a realist, you never want to be Milos. You never want to be the Milos of the situation because you must suffer what you must. But of course, it's also an interesting story about the nature of power. You see, because let me ask you something. If this is a story about the nature of power, I would ask what power is. And most of you would say, power is the ability to get what you want. But of course, the Athenians did not get what they wanted, right? The Athenians had power, but they did not get what they wanted because they wanted ships and they did not get them. And so, power is, for realists, the ability to limit choices and to ascribe positive and negative consequences for choices you like and you don't like. Power is not the ability to get what you want, but it's the ability to go up to someone and say, do this or else. It's the ability to go to the Melians and say, build ships for me or I will kill you all. That's the nature of power for realists. Now immediately, if that's the nature of power for realists, we can draw some conclusions. By power, we therefore mean inherently military power. Because in a self-help system, your institutions or your economic power will mean very little. Let me tell you another story. In the 16th century, 16th, 17th century, England and Holland get into a trade war. A trade war is basically one of these wars where they're not necessarily fighting directly, but it's about who can sort of make the most money and win in a trade war. And the Dutch say, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to build a huge fleet full of trading ships, fast trading ships, and we're going to compete with the British everywhere. We're going to leverage our economic power to make as much money as possible. The Brits build battleships and sink the Dutch ships and win the trade war. Power, for realists, is inherently military power. Military power is the power that counts. Because in a self-help system, your ability to leverage your economic power doesn't mean much. But of course, this can lead to what we call a security dilemma. And a security dilemma is essentially this idea that if everyone is increasing their military power, everyone else will continue to increase their military power because no one wants to be on the bottom. So if we all increase our military power, and the person with the lowest amount of military power starts to freak out and doubles down on building, and then they're on top, every other country does not want to stay on the bottom, and so they also all build build up their military power, and so on and so forth. So because of this, realists argue that war is more or less inevitable. War is just another tool of diplomacy. And once you understand that war is inevitable, not a positive, but an inevitability, something that you should come to terms with, like death or taxes, then your portfolio of options becomes different. Because what you want to avoid is not war necessarily, but what we call great power war. Now keep in mind, international relations is a school and a discipline that is very modern. And the first ideas of international relation that really codified come out in the 1950s. Now, what has just happened in the 1950s? World War II. And so that is one of the most destructive wars of history. And because of that, classical realists want to avoid that situation as much as possible. And they do so with what we call the balance of power. When power is balanced in the system, when there is an equal distribution of military capabilities amongst major powers in the system, war becomes inevitable. Not inevitable. Becomes less frequent. The opposite. It becomes less frequent because countries are not going to go to war with each other if it means destroying themselves. Now, it doesn't mean that war does not happen, But what you want to avoid is great power war, the kind of war between major powers that is destructive to the nth degree, and that can destroy countries for generations. Now, realists point to this idea of the Concert of Europe. The Concert of Europe was a system of power that existed after the Napoleonic Wars in Europe, in which all the countries in Europe roughly had similar amounts of political and military power. And sure enough, peace was maintained. Now, what realists refer to this is multipolarity, the distribution of power in a multipolarized world where various countries have power. Because in an anarchic world, no one is king. And for realists, they argue nobody should be king. Now, the father of classical realism is a man named Hans Morgenthau. And we're going to look into the text here in particular on Morgenthau. Morgenthau was born in Germany in the early 1900s. He studies in Germany before escaping the Nazis in the late 1930s. His real major work, Politics Among Nations, is published in 1948. That should give you a sense of what he's trying to avoid, what he is reacting to in his book, Politics Among Nations. He becomes a professor of politics at the University of Chicago and in New York at CUNY, and finally he dies in 1980. And in Politics Among Nations, of which you had to read the first chapter, there are 6 principles of political realism. We're going to go through all 6 of them. The first one is that political realism believes that politics is governed by objective laws that have their roots in human nature. And yet examinations of the facts is not enough. To give meaning to the factual raw material of foreign policy, we must approach political reality with a kind of rational outline. In other words, we put ourselves in the position of statesmen who must meet a certain problem of foreign policy. We must ask ourselves what the rational alternatives are. And so principle 1, politics as a byproduct of human nature is both objective and rational. Simple. Principle 2, the main sign point that helps political realism to find its way through the landscape of international politics is the concept of interest. Bold, highlight, underline that in your notes. Defined in terms of political power. Interest is the most important thing. What's important to know is not the motives of the statesman, but his intellectual ability to comprehend the essentials of foreign policy, as well as his political ability to translate that into successful political action. It follows that while ethics in the abstract judges the moral qualities of motives, political theory must judge the political qualities of intellect, will, and action. Because political realism considers a rational foreign policy to be a good foreign policy. For a rational foreign policy minimizes risks and maximizes benefits, cost-benefit analysis, and therefore complies both with the moral precept of prudence and the political requirement of success. And so, principle 2, rational self-interest motivates the behavior of states, determined, and this is important, by the calculable accumulation of power. There is this idea that your interests are calculable. They're not this sort of nebulous thing that you can maybe define and maybe not depending on the day. You can figure out what your interests are and how you can accumulate more power. Principle 3. Realism assumes that its key concept of interest defined as power is an objective category, which is universally valid, but does not endow that concept with a meaning that is fixed once and for all. In fact, the idea of interest is indeed the essence of politics and is unaffected by the circumstances of time and of place. The kind of interest determining political action in a political period of history depends upon the political and cultural context in which foreign policy is formulated. So what he is saying is that while goals change through times, the reasons why countries, I'm sorry, there's a typo here, pursue those goals have not changed. So while your goals may change, the reason why you pursue them has not. Because, principle 3, interest is a universal concept that is applicable in all contexts. So while the goals of states may change, the reasons why those goals are pursued has not. Principle 4, political realism is aware of the moral significance of political action. It is also aware that there is tension between moral command and the requirements of successful political action. Very Machiavellian here, if you harken back to our idea of virtu. Realism maintains that universal moral principles cannot be applied to the actions of states in their abstract, universal formation, but they must be filtered through the concrete circumstances of time and place. Morality does not apply to states, only interest does. Because there can be no political reality without prudence. That is, without consideration of the political consequences of seemingly moral action. It may be moral to say, intervene to topple dictators all over the world. But realists would ask whether that is prudent, whether that is wise, whether without political consideration, this may seem moral on surface, but you should maybe be prudent about that. Realism then considers prudence, the weighing of the consequences of alternative political actions, to be the supreme virtue in politics. Because importantly, states have a responsibility to their citizens to ensure their survival. Right? States have a responsibility to the citizens that put them in place, very Hobbesian, to ensure that the state continues to exist. The United States has a responsibility to the citizens of the United States to ensure its own survival, to not get invaded by Canada or Mexico or China. That's its job. That's its primary job. And so principle 4 is very simply, states cannot place moral principles above their own survival. Principle 5, we're almost done. Political realism refuses to identify the moral aspirations of a particular nation with moral laws that govern the universe. It is exactly the concept of interest, defined in terms of power, that saves us from what he calls moral excess. For if we look at all nations as political entities pursuing their respective interests defined in terms of power, we are able to do justice to all of them. Because, and this is important, self-interest is not about morals or ethics. It's about power and politics. And part of realism is the recognition that that's fine, that's okay, right? Self-interest, principle 5, should not be framed as a moral argument. The acquisition of power is a question of survival, not ethics, not morals. Your survival is important, and the acquisition of power is how you get there. And the last principle, principle 6, is that intellectually, the political realist maintains the autonomy of the political sphere. He thinks of interest in terms of interest defined as power. Recognizing, however, that different facets of human nature exist, political realism also recognizes that in order to understand one of them has to deal with it on its own terms. Essentially, political realism understands international politics as different and separate from economics, laws, and morals. Leave considerations of wealth to the economists. Leave considerations of law to the lawyers, and considerations of morals to the philosophers. As political realists and scholars of the international relations system, we look only at power. Because Principle 6, in political realism, the only consideration that matters is power. So what does all this mean? Well, if you look at classical realism, I have found that classical realism is one of the simplest ways to understand international relations. It is fundamentally basic and yet is very compelling. I look forward to seeing your reactions to this idea, to this theory of international relations in the discussion section for this module. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact me, message me, email me. You know the drill. And I think that's it for now. Have a wonderful day. See you in the next one. Bye-bye.